slavery, colonialism, and systemic racism. The Yoruba, or Igbo peoples of Nigeria and Ghana, but the Global Reparations Fund would also need to address American Indians who were enslaved and displaced by the same colonial powers. Former British Prime Minister David Cameron's family recently acknowledged its ancestral links to slavery in Jamaica. This comes after former U.S. President Joe Biden campaigned on and was elected in part for his commitment to establish a committee to study the logistics of reparations for slavery. He went on to abdicate that responsibility for all 4 years of his incumbency.
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up out of your sleep!
Leaders from Africa, the Caribbean, and the global African diaspora renewed their calls for reparatory justice this week at the United Nations, urging the creation of a Global Reparations Fund and demanding action from nations and institutions that profited from centuries of slavery, colonialism, and systemic racism. Speaking at the 4th session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in New York, representatives from the African Union, the Caribbean Community, also known as CARICOM, and civil society organizations presented a united front. They called for reparations not only as compensation for historical crimes, but also as a path toward dismantling persistent racial inequities rooted in the transatlantic slave trade. Africa was under siege, said Hillary Brown, representing CARICOM. Her political, economic, and social systems were thrown into chaotic instability as Europe plundered the continent for her most valuable asset, her people. Brown emphasized the growing alliance between CARICOM and the African Union, highlighting the AU's 2025 theme, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent Through Reparations. The theme, leaders say, reflects a defining moment for the global reparations movement as both regions come together to speak with one voice. Delegates referenced a major step forward taken last year at a summit in Accra, Ghana, where African and Caribbean leaders announced plans to create a global reparations fund. While full details have yet to be finalized, the fund would be headquartered in Africa and would serve as a financial vehicle to support reparatory programs and long-term development for communities harmed by slavery and colonialism. Full formal apologies from former colonial powers, debt cancellation, public health investments, and the repatriation of cultural artifacts and displaced peoples. CARICOM hasn't yet disclosed logistical details on how reparations fund reimbursements would reach the harmed populations, such as the Yoruba or Igbo peoples of Nigeria and Ghana, for example. These populations have significant diasporic representation in the Caribbean as well as in South America. The Jamaican patois dialect, for example, includes many Igbo words, and a modern city in Belize is actually named Abo-A for Igbo. About 10.3 million slaves were taken from Africa to the Americas, but the Global Reparations Fund would also need to address American Indians who were enslaved and displaced by the same colonial powers. While there were about 4.4 million colored people in the United States at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, according to the 1860 census, only 388,747 slaves were brought to mainland North America in total. That's according to the Slave Voyages database. The rest are typically assumed to have been Africans produced by procreation, both consensually among slaves and due to white men raping slave women. However, expert demographic historians unanimously agree that this requires an almost humanly impossible birth rate from that African population in the decades allotted from 1619 to 1860. That's confirmed by J. David Hacker, a University of Minnesota historian who specializes in 19th century demography and contributed slave population and labor statistics to a USA Today article in 2019 commemorating the 400-year anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade's arrival in North America. In tandem with the fact that only about a third of the African slaves were female, it's mathematically discernible that many of the black Americans of slave descent are likely more indigenous than they are African. This is further supported by the Bonampak murals left behind by the ancient Mayans, in which they depict themselves as dark brown people with coarse, curly hair. Canada and the United States would need to independently raise funds to socio-economically restore Black American Indians, who are predominantly denied both tribal citizenship and land reserves by federally recognized Native Americans.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
The momentum behind the movement comes as institutions and governments are beginning to reckon with their own historical roles in slavery. Former British Prime Minister David Cameron's family recently acknowledged its ancestral links to slavery in Jamaica and announced a personal £100,000 donation toward reparatory efforts. Still, reparations advocates argue that such gestures fall far short of the systemic response needed. Apologies alone are not enough, said Angela A. Affoley-Odai of the African Union Commission. We want a collective approach towards seeking regress. Odai called for coordination across the African Union's 55 member states to develop and advocate for cohesive reparatory demands. Leaders emphasized the need to engage not only governments but also universities, churches, and private sector entities that historically benefited from slavery. This comes after former U.S. President Joe Biden campaigned on and was elected in part for his commitment to establish a committee to study the logistics of reparations for slavery. He went on to abdicate that responsibility for all 4 years of his incumbency. Nkechi Taifa, director of the U.S.-based Reparation Education Project, underscored the role of civil society in fueling the movement. It was not governments but the unstoppable fire of the people that ignited the global movement for reparations, she said, invoking the legacy of activists like Marcus Garvey and Audley Moore. Taifa urged the Permanent Forum to remain a space where grassroots organizations and governments meet as equals to shape a shared reparations agenda. We are displaced but never disconnected, she said of the African diaspora. The United Nations, which has formally recognized slavery and the transatlantic slave trade as crimes against humanity, reiterated its support for reparatory justice. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in remarks prepared for the forum, said the global community must establish reparatory justice frameworks grounded in international human rights law, with full participation from affected communities. The UN's position is grounded in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, adopted at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, which called for remedial actions to address both historical and continuing discrimination. June Sumer, a member of the Permanent Forum and moderator of the session, said, "The issue of reparations is a critical and urgent global priority." The movement has gained traction in recent years amid growing global awareness of systemic racism and historical injustices. In the Caribbean, reparations commissions have been established in nearly every CARICOM country. In the United Kingdom, family foundations and institutions with slavery ties, including some banks and universities, are beginning to offer financial contributions or public apologies. Still, activists argue that a patchwork of piecemeal efforts must evolve into a coordinated, comprehensive strategy. That includes legal negotiations, high-level diplomacy, and significant financial commitments from countries and institutions that built their wealth through centuries of enslavement. As CARICOM's Hillary Brown put it, this is the moment for joint action. We must negotiate with all the entities that benefited from African enslavement. The fourth Permanent Forum on People of African Descent continues through Thursday at UN headquarters, where discussions will further explore strategies to address past atrocities and ongoing inequalities impacting African-descended populations globally.
Where it was first institutionalized on a small rock in the middle of the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, 166 square miles, more or less the size of the Gaza Strip. $4.9 trillion. And in 1625, when the British settlers first landed, they continued without interruption until independence in 1966. The debt, estimated because we were the home of modern racism. That's where it was first institutionalized, on a small rock in the middle of the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, 166 square miles, more or less the size of the Gaza Strip. $4.9 trillion. And in 1625, when the British settlers first landed, they continued without interruption until independence in 1966.